Well, thanks everyone. I feel like what I'm about to say is sort of a bit of preaching to the choir because, you know, you're all at Future Day anyway, so you obviously think the future is important enough to come along. But I just wanted to say, make a few remarks about why I think the future is important to think about. And particularly what I wanted to emphasize with two ideas basically, that why we should think about the future, think seriously about the future, and the second idea is that we can meaningfully think about the future, not just as sort of as an armchair speculation. So maybe if you could all just sort of think for a moment about how often you or people you know or both seriously think about the future. So I don't mean like next month, but like what's going to happen in 5 years time, 10 years time, 50 years time, either in your life or the lives of your family or people you know, or, you know, society, mankind as a whole. I don't know about you, but I probably think more about that than most, and I don't even think about it that much. I think it's very easy for us all to get sort of caught up in what we do every day and going through the motions of everything. And that's important, and we can't be all thinking high in the sky all the time. But that said, I think there is an important place in sort of considering, like, why are we doing this? What are we heading towards as individuals or as a society? So that's the idea that I wanted to sort of frame my remarks around, sort of how often do we think about the future and what do we think about when we do that? An interesting exercise that I like to think about is, in order to look forward, looking back. That is, imagine what someone 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, 50 years ago, it doesn't really matter, someone in the past, if they were looking forward into the future now, what do you think they would have expected? What would they have predicted, or what would they be surprised about? What would they not be surprised about? What would they be happy about? What would they wish could be different? It's not really easy to answer that question because, I mean, it depends on who you're talking about and what time frame and so on. But I think it is interesting to think about, how would a person from 100 years ago, maybe one of our ancestors for instance, have reacted if they were transported today? How would we react if we were transported 100 years into the future? I think when we talk about the future, it's easy to get distracted to a degree about technological advances and, you know, science fiction and stuff like that, because obviously there's a lot of change in those sorts of things. So someone taken from 100 years in the past would have never seen, well, really a car, well, maybe they were just sort of coming in about a century ago. Video cameras, computers, of course, is a huge change that's happened. Even a lot of the buildings that we have just over there are much taller than anything that people would have seen 100 years ago. Smartphones, obviously, a massive change. So we have all these gadgets and other technological things that exist now, but that's not the entirety of what's changed. In fact, arguably that's not even the most important things that have changed. Society changes as well, needless to say. So 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, women weren't allowed to vote pretty much anywhere. That's really not that long ago if you think about it. That's something that we would consider to be just completely alien to our consciousness now. The idea that, you know, a lot of people would think that it's a good idea, or at least an okay idea, to not have half the population voting. Slavery was only abolished in America, if we're looking at a century ago. That was only a few decades before. So that's something that's, you know, plenty of ex-slaves still alive. Again, that's something that's just totally alien to our experience now, that wasn't so alien 100 years ago. Any number of other things as well about the importance of religion in society, or family structure, attitudes towards divorce, the type of education that you could expect to receive, or the type of employment that you would expect to get. Any number of things like that have changed dramatically, even in the past 30 years, 40 years, 100 years, and so on. Employment is an interesting one to think about, because a question that you've all probably been asked before, and we like to ask people, is to children or high school age students, what do you want to be when you grow up? Something that we perhaps don't think about very often is that a lot of what people will end up being when they grow up are things, occupations that don't exist yet, or at least don't exist in anything like the current form. So, I mean, if you think about the number of people here or in society in general who work in, well, let's take, for example, anything to do with the internet, any occupation that heavily engages with the internet, web design or whatever else, that didn't exist 20, 25 years ago. So all those occupations are new. And that's just one example. If we consider the number of occupations that people work in today that didn't exist a century ago, or that our grandparents or great-grandparents couldn't have even really imagined, it's probably a very substantial fraction of what people are doing today. So that's another thing that we perhaps don't think about very often, is just how much our lives change or the lives of people in society change in terms of what we're doing, in terms of our family structure, in terms of how we live, and all these sorts of things. So the other thing about the future, though, is it's not like the past in one important sense. We can think about the past and think, well, how different things were back then, but obviously there's nothing we can do to change the past because it's the past. But the future is something we can change, at least potentially, at least to some degree, and at the very least for ourselves. We can take actions to try and move towards a better future or a worse future from whatever our perspective is of our goals. And so I guess what I'm saying here is, given how many things change over time and how many things we can expect to change in the future, it's worth spending some time thinking about what type of future we would like to see, again, for ourselves and for the people we know, but also for society as a whole, and think about what we could do to try and move in the direction that we would like to see. Obviously, as individuals, for most of us, there's probably not a lot we can do to dramatically change the direction of the entire human race, but there may be small things that we can do, or ways that we can make a contribution. And that's something we probably don't think about very often, and I think we should think more about. So that was the sort of first idea that I wanted to get across about why we should think about the future, why that's worth doing. The other thing I wanted to talk about is sort of that we can meaningfully think about the future, because some people might say, again, probably not so much people here, well, maybe some, might say, well, I can see why we might want to think about the future, because, you know, we can shape a lot of things, or we could potentially shape a lot of things that might happen, but we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's so many unknowns, particularly when you're talking about 10, 50, 100 years in the future. I mean, how can we know what's going to happen then? And obviously that's true, the future is unknown. We can't know what's going to happen. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And we should be skeptical of any people who pretend to have very specific knowledge or very certain knowledge about what's going to happen. But that said, I do think that it is possible to think meaningfully and to make form meaningful, useful expectations about the type of things that are likely to happen. And these, I think, can usefully shape the way we act, what we choose to focus on, and how we choose to live our lives. So, as an example, I just pulled up an interesting article that I found from an individual by the name of John Watkins. So he was an American railway engineer, and he wrote in 1900, so this is over a century ago, making basically some predictions about what he thought the world was going to be like around the year 2000, or around our time. And you may have heard lists of these before, because there are a few people who've done this. Let me just read out a few of them. Let's see. Huge forts on wheels will dash across open spaces at the speed of express trains of today. So that sounds a lot like tanks. Ready-cooked meals will be bought from establishments similar to bakeries of today. Sounds like fast food, or pre-cooked meals at supermarkets. This one's really interesting. Photographs will be telegraphed from any distance. If there be a battle in China 100 years hence, snapshots of its most striking events will be published in the newspapers an hour later. Photographs will reproduce all of nature's colours. So if anything, he was too conservative there, because if there's a battle in China or wherever else these days, we see pictures of it on the internet within probably minutes, not within hours. Physicians will be able to see and diagnose internal organs of a moving living body by rays of invisible light. X-rays, CAT scans, etc. Of course, he didn't get everything right. Mosquitoes, houseflies, and roaches will have been exterminated. Not so much, particularly in some parts of the world. All traffic will be below or above ground when brought within city limits. Unfortunately, not the case. So there's some others here, but I won't belabor the point. There's another interesting list that some people may have heard of that Isaac Asimov wrote 50 years ago. Yes, which again a mixture of some very interesting prescient and some rather interestingly not so prescient predictions. There's one other one that I wanted to mention before commenting on what I think about this. So this prediction was made almost 100 years ago now by a French general by the name of Ferdinand Foch. This was in the aftermath of the First World War, and during the Treaty of Versailles he was dissatisfied with how things were going basically and the arrangements that were being made. And he observed that this is not a peace, it's an armistice for 20 years. And he said that in 1919. Now obviously he got lucky to an extent that there's no way he could have known what would happen in 20 years' time. But I do think that it's not a coincidence that he got that right, in the sense that he had insight into the circumstances, political, military, and other things that were happening at the time. And he was able to use that knowledge to make a reasonable prediction about the course of future events. And that doesn't mean that he had clairvoyance or something like that. Likewise, for the railway engineer, he was obviously an individual who was familiar with technology and interested in science, and he looked at the world around him and how things were developing, and he made some informed judgments, some predictions about what would happen. And some of them came true and some of them didn't. And it's often interesting to see in what ways they came true and what ways they didn't come true. But just these few ideas, and of course there are others that we could discuss, I hope illustrate the point that it is at least possible, it has at least happened, that we can think about even the far future and say some meaningful things about it. We can look at the way society is, the way technology is developing, the way society is changing, the way political situations are developing, and think about, well, what's more likely to happen? What situations can we expect to happen? And how might we change our behavior, or at least think about changing what we do or what we focus on to take more advantage of this, or to shape things in a way such that developments will proceed more in line with what we want to happen. So today, for example, we can think about things like, in the political situation, we can look at China and think, well, how is that developing? The Chinese government, the Chinese economy, what implications does this have for our future? We could think about the continued growth of the internet, information technology, and artificial intelligence, and think, what implications might this have for society, for employment, or other things like that. We could look at various civil rights, social justice movements, maybe gay rights and other things like that, and think, what implications might this have for the future of society, and in relation to technology, so gene technologies and things like that. I'm not advocating here that we start trying to make lists of predictions and maximize our number that we get right, because that's not really the point. The point is thinking seriously about where are we now and where are we going, and what meaningful things can we potentially say about what's likely to happen, what's less likely to happen, and what can we do to try and make the future something that looks more like what we'd like it to be. So that's basically all I had to say. I guess I'll just close by saying that I think that the Future Day is a really important idea, because there are so many holidays and commemorations which celebrate or commemorate things that have happened in the past, and that's obviously very important. But we can't change things that have happened in the past. We can hopefully learn from them, but we can potentially change what's going to happen in the future. And so I think probably we should spend more time than we do trying to seriously think about that, and think about the future, how it might be, how we might like it, how we might not like it, and what we can do to make it better, both for ourselves and for humanity as a whole. And yeah, well, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you found it interesting.
Q&A.
Any questions or comments?
Can you think of any examples of how thinking about the future has actually changed people's actions?
Well, that's very hard to say, because we never have the counterfactual, do we? We never know what they would have done if they hadn't thought about the future.
Well, I mean, surely people make actions in order to make this. I mean, one example in the medium term is just like shorting a company and we think it go bankrupt. But is there any long term? Is there any actions which are being causally generated by long term predictions?
Maybe, I don't know. It seems to me that if we try to seriously engage in that, we could end up discussing it for hours on end, like, well, did this action really make a difference or not? There's something that an example that comes to mind is different, again, this might be controversial, but Patrick asked the question, so I'll put it out there. Different countries' reaction in, say, the late 19th century or around that period to modernization, westernization. So some countries, like arguably Japan, saw the need to modernize their economy, their military, their political system. And that led to a lot of good and a lot of bad, but the point is they reacted differently to countries like China, who, one of the Chinese emperors in the late 18th century famously said that when a diplomatic mission came from England, and they brought all these new gadgets and technology, and they were wanting to set up trade relations, and the emperor said basically, we don't have any need for your manufacturers, we have everything we need, we're not interested. So I would cite that as an example of very short-sighted thinking, very much not really considering, not having knowledge of, the implications that these technologies and changes would have for the world, but specifically for China, for the Chinese government. So, yeah, I think countries have responded, and the leadership of countries have in the past responded differently to these sorts of changing situations. Another example I might cite, on the similar note, is the different reactions that communist governments took in Soviet Union versus China in regards to changes in technology and society and what was considered to be a sort of acceptable form of government. The Chinese government pursued one sort of reform, sort of gradual economic reforms, holding onto the political power. And again, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying that they pursued one line, whereas other countries, like maybe the Soviet Union, arguably, didn't reform in that way. Arguably, were more short-sighted in the way that they refused to acknowledge the change that were happening and tried to hold on to the way things had been done, and they were not as successful. So that's an arguable case.
I think we do have one, and that's Korea. Just look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea in 50 years. It's 10 inches of growth.
But this isn't necessarily because of future thinking. It could just be due to like lots of short-term.
Arguably, it's an event. I agree with you, but the whole way they settled that maybe could be. It's hard to say, but you can at least see though. I agree. No one decided, we're going to run this experiment.
I think that in 50 years, capitalism is the better choice.
But it's not that simple. But it's just interesting to see that you can see counterfactuals of completely different outcomes. Yeah. Not because someone thought about the future. I take your point there, Richard, but it can make a big difference, those decisions.
Good government can make the right thinking.
Anyone else?
So are you saying that like, North Korea and South Korea, that is kind of counterfactual in the sense that wasn't communism kind of like a planned system, whereas capitalism is a more unplanned.
Communists are future thinkers, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think it's more complex than just communism and capitalism, but there was a society that two halves of which took completely different tracks for lots of reasons, not because someone sat down and thought about the future.
No, well, that's
but you got a completely different
my
outcome.
point is that the communist North Korea, that's what they did. They did have some sort of centralised plan. They did think about the future, and they thought their centralised planning was going to lead to
I think you can argue that North Korea is not a communist state. It's a godlike state of inheritance.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get into a great long political discussion about that. But more just that they chose different paths. I didn't want to get into an argument as to why, and they had completely different outcomes.
I think there are examples of that we can see and potentially learn from.
Yeah.
James, how do you think thinking about the future may have changed your behaviour or what you want to do with your life?
That's a good question. How do I think thinking about the future might have changed my life or what I want to do? Well, probably quite a lot. So I'm interested in a lot of things I'm interested in relate to how I think the world is going to change in the next decades to a century or something like that. So I'm particularly interested in artificial intelligence because I think that will dramatically change a lot of aspects of the economy and the way we see humanity and all sorts of things, which we needn't get into the details of. But so I think that's shaped a lot of what I spend my time on. It's like things that I study and why I do that. Another thing is that I guess my very big concern with global development and poverty partly relates to looking to the future. That might sound a little bit odd, but because, how can I say this? I think a lot about what these countries will be like in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or 50 years' time and compare that to other countries, how they were 50 years ago and how they are now. So that's sort of an issue of not thinking so much about what's going to happen next year, but what could happen in 10 years' time or 50 years' time that'll be much better, and what could we potentially do to change that? Climate change might be another example of that sort of longer term thinking, although that's not something that I'm as focused on. But I guess just generally, I spend a lot of time talking and trying to encourage people to think more, a larger perspective. So, not just about who's going to win the next election, but what type of political system are we setting up here or is happening overseas that will shape what happens in 10 or 50 years' time. So I think that's another example of how that shapes what I think about. Anyone else?
What tools or resources do you suggest to try and develop these skills, like thinking about the future and
Well, there's a whole discipline called futurology, future studies. I don't know how useful it is, to be honest. So there's probably some insights there. My personal opinion would be that we can gain a lot of general insight about thinking about long-term developments by looking at the past. And I say general insight because I don't say that we can predict particular things. Again, that's not really the point. But I think looking at how things have changed in the past gives us some sense of how much societies can change and in what sort of directions they change. So some of the examples I cited before, having some knowledge of just how much things have changed in regards to, say, voting rights over the past few centuries. That doesn't tell us what's going to happen, in 50 years' time regarding democracy, but I think it gives some sense of perspective. It gives us, in the sense, some general tools of thinking about these sorts of things, or of political change, likewise, or of military history and things like that. Again, this might just be my bias speaking, but I would tend to say that we as a society are too focused on the sort of present, what's immediately happening now, or what happened last week, or what's going to happen next week. And I don't think that gives us, talking about that and focusing on that all the time, I don't think it helps develop the same sort of set of thinking tools that are necessary for thinking about longer term developments.
Did you spend any time studying scenario planning?
What, sorry? No. No.
That was one of those management blows.
Yes.
Particularly by Shell, for example, in the 80s and 90s, where they said they made 2 points. First of all, you actually can say some quite predictable things about the future. For example, we can say with a great deal of accuracy how many people will be aged between 40 and 45 20 years from now. We'll know that pretty well. Other things you can't. So they spent a lot of time, I'm not sure how well successfully they did it in the long run, about envisaging different scenarios, and they brought in lots of people from outside their organisation to come up with weird ones and tried to think through, well, if that's what it would be like, how would that unfold? So at a time, at least, it was quite in vogue as a means of thinking about the future. I wonder if you had any look at that.
And it served them very well in the 70s with the oil shock.
Yes.
They made a load of money because of this scenario.
And the rumour is that it's what the CIA and people like that do all the time, and I don't want to go there, but...
I seem to recall hearing that they sort of did some scenario planning in the late 80s, and they were like, okay, well, we're prepared for these sorts of different scenarios. What would we do if the Soviet Union collapsed? And how can we sort of position ourselves so that if that was to occur, we would, I guess, benefit from it? And the podcast I was listening to sort of said, so they made certain decisions, which meant that when it did collapse, they were certainly ready to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I did spend some time studying, and the challenge they had was that you could sort of break them into two. There was the sort of, I'll call them the obvious scenarios, but the ones they struggled with was the black swan events that are inherently unpredictable but could happen, that can completely transform, such as the downfall of the Soviet Union. So anyway, it's an interesting sort of thought exercise.
I guess there's a different group of people who think about the future after they've decided to make a decision. So they have to make an investment decision, and then they have to, after they've decided to make an investment decision, figure out what the best decision is. So Shell would be one of those groups, I guess, and someone who first decides they want to learn a language, and then afterwards decides, I'm going to look at the world and predict the future and see which one's the best language to pick. So that's coming at a different angle, I guess. Instead of looking at the future and then making a decision, you make a decision to make a decision, and then go look at the future and decide what the best one is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's exactly the sort of thing that we should perhaps spend a bit more time thinking about. So I think career choice is a really good example of that. I don't know how many people think about this when they're deciding what to study, but it seems logical to me to think, well, what sort of careers or what sort of jobs are going to be more in demand in 20 years' time? And that's hard to predict, but there are certain things you can say, like certain things you can be like an example I'd like to give is the car manufacturing industry in Australia. It's been pretty obvious for a very long time that that's on the way out. You might not be able to say exactly when or how long, but that's pretty obviously not going to be something that it's good good to sort of base your career on. And other things like, well, information technology. Again, you know, that we had the dot-com boom, so people can have inflated expectations. But broadly speaking, it's still been a pretty good bet that that's a good place to get the skills in over the past few decades. So yeah, when we do need to make decisions, like for example about jobs or where to live, might be another one, or even what country to live in, what language to learn, all sorts of things. Yeah, I think we can meaningfully think about how future developments are going to affect that, and probably we don't do that very much, and we should probably do it more.
Maybe there's the whole 0 to 1 thing about, is the future something you can predict? And some people don't think it is, so they try to hedge their bets and try not to think about it too much. And if you're more of a deterministic view, if you have more of a deterministic view and you think the future can be predicted and your actions will have an impact on it, you're more future-minded because you're kind of sucked into it.
Well, potentially, but there's two things you said there. One is you said that some people don't think we can predict the future, and you also said that some people hedge their bets. So I would see those as sort of different things.
Because they don't think
yes, so potentially, but
it's probabilistic.
Someone, sorry, you also said that some people don't try not to think about it too much, or don't like to think about it too much. And I think that's the real issue, because if you're thinking about the future and decide that it's inherently unpredictable, or there's a great deal of uncertainty, then I think that's quite plausible, and then a rational decision might be to hedge your bets or to diversify or something like that. But that's very different to sort of throwing up one's hands and saying, well, I have no idea, so I'm just not going to think about it, or think about it as little as I can. And I think that can lead to very short-sighted decisions sometimes. So,
I guess if you're of the opinion that it's unpredictable, it's kind of an infinite amount of time you can spend thinking about it with no use. So a lot of people just, it's irrelevant to them, sort of thing. Anything could happen, I can't predict it, I don't know what's going to happen. All I can do is just hedge against the worst and hope for the best. As opposed to other people who are like, I'm going to spend time figuring out what the future is going to look like, or I'm going to make it. And if you have that mindset or that inclination, you're going to be more future-minded, I guess. Because you're going to make investments for the future. Like if you're a hedge fund manager and you have no idea about what to invest in, you're not a very good hedge fund manager, and you're like, I have no idea, I have no clue. As opposed to someone who's like, I can predict what's going to happen to some degree, and I'm going to make bets on that. Then you're going to go out and hunt for the information to fulfill your mind with your predictions, as opposed to someone who's like, it doesn't matter how much information I put in, I'm not going to have good predictions.
Partly perhaps that's something that we as people interested in the future might try to work on just in our interactions with other people, because I think there's a tension between one situation where basically you never think about the future, or you just think that it's a complete waste of time and it's nothing you bother about. The other extreme, I think, is certain people who think they can make quite specific predictions about, exactly what stocks you should invest in, or, this country's government's going to collapse in, 5 years' time, and then this is going to happen and whatever. That there are people who think that they can have worked it all out, and I think that, as with a lot of things, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and we have to try and advocate a balanced course of saying, well, no, you can't make really specific predictions, or at least very rarely can you about that sort of thing, and we should be distracted by this sort of thing. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that we can't say anything meaningful, but it's a complete waste of time to think about it all. And so I think we should try and forge a middle ground there and try and encourage other people to take that more seriously. And maybe that's something we sort of have to live out in our lives, just sort of casually talk about it more, about the future. I mean, I don't know how often we sort of talk about that with our friends or family or whatever. Just the future. About, well, that's it.
We predicted 10 out of the last 5 years.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's an example, yes.
Ask two economists an opinion, then you get 3 answers.
If you want change for the better, you've got to affect that change. Now, I was hired by a company to suggest changes for the better in their systems to save them work. But the people I had to talk to do it said, we haven't got time for that. We're working too hard. They had no time to think about the future, and that was programmed into the system. So I mean, the people who really make a difference are those who plan and design and create and make the changes.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent illustration, I guess, of what I'm talking about. That some institutions, companies or governments or whatever, are just not very receptive to that sort of change. They're just sort of stuck in the way things are, and if we find ourselves enmeshed in those situations, there's often not much we can do about it as a single person. You can't change the entire culture, but what we can do is be aware of this sort of thing and try to potentially influence to whatever degree we can the culture around us, to try and be a bit more future-oriented, and also just to, I guess, potentially seek out the types of situations or environments where we will be able to utilize our skills or predilections in that sort of direction. So yeah, unfortunately, there's often not a lot we can do, but we can try in our whatever influence we have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. I should note that we've got a specific talk on can we actually predict the future from philosopher of science here, John Wilkins. So yeah.